Today on Anthodish, I'm interviewing Dr. Beth Jolley, who is a family medicine resident through McMaster University. Beth and I grew up in Peterborough, Ontario, without ever knowing each other, and met when we were placed together as roommates at the University of Guelph in first year. She's one of those rare, beautiful people who is crazy insightful and thoughtful in all of her work, but also very humble about her accomplishments. Throughout our friendship, I've always known her to take a uniquely holistic approach to issues, integrating the artistic and the scientific into questions about life, health, well-being, and everything in between that. On today's episode, we sit down and talk about her experiences as a young doctor, focusing on nutrition and diet from her medical perspective. We talk about diet culture and some of the main misconceptions or challenges in tackling this culture as a doctor. We also talk about barriers to nutritional knowledge, holistic frameworks to look at health and diet, and eating behaviors at end of life. This is a really interesting episode, and I'm so grateful for her to have taken the time out of her crazy schedule to sit down and dish on diet culture with us. Welcome, Beth. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Pretty well. The coffee hasn't quite kicked in yet, so it's going to be fun.
Necessary part.
Yeah, exactly. So can you give us some quick background on who you are and what sorts of influences that you had growing up or along your professional journey?
Sure. So I guess at this point I'd identify as a 27-year-old family medicine resident, currently about to enter my final year of training before independent practice. So for those of you who don't watch medical shows or who are lucky enough to have avoided the healthcare system thus far, a resident is a medical doctor who's completing additional training in a specific specialty before beginning their independent practice. So for me, that's family medicine, which most people tend to refer to as general practice. So this phrase has largely fallen out of favor now. In terms of educational background, I did my medical degree at McMaster University at the Niagara Regional Campus. And then before that, did a Bachelor of Arts and Science at the University of Guelph, where I was lucky enough to meet Sarah here.
Woo, roomies.
And, of course, we're both from Peterborough, Ontario, which was completely random that we ended up in the same dorm in first year.
Yeah.
But, before my academic endeavors, I was working at Country Style Donuts in my hometown and, learning lots of great, valuable life skills that I think still serve me today. In terms of other kind of formative times in my life, I think for me, university was a big one. My undergrad at the University of Guelph. I think we don't really realize until we look back that a big part of who we become is formed during those years. So for me, meeting everyone I did at the University of Guelph, becoming independent, living on my own was probably one of the most transformative times of my life. But from a professional point, I think I owe a lot to the 27 people I trained with for medical school who, are so wonderful and are going to fill the field of healthcare with so much enthusiasm and knowledge. And as a physician, I feel like I owe a lot to all the different patients who I've encountered to this point. There's a lot of self-doubt and stress that comes with a relatively new title of doctor. And I think, I owe a lot to the patients who have welcomed me so warmly into their lives as I continue to train and learn more.
That's really beautiful. I love that you also are referencing your patients in terms of how they inspire you, because that's the Beth that I know, but
yeah. Makes it all worth it.
Totally. I can imagine. I don't actually know. So I want to back up a little bit because I know when we first met, like even then you were pretty, I don't know if you had decided if you had wanted to be a doctor yet or not, but you were pretty much like set within your passions in terms of medical science and stuff like that. So did you always know that you wanted to be a doctor, or was that kind of like, as you experienced university, that kind of grew in you?
So it's funny, I've come to realize this over time that being a doctor was one of those things that I always thought, well, I get good grades, so I should probably consider this as an option, because that's kind of what I always thought. If you're smart, being a doctor should be an option for you. So whether or not that was a pure motive when I first started to pursue it, is open to debate. But I think for me, medicine is such a beautiful mix of physiology and science, and then the human condition that I was always so interested in, like when I pursued the arts part of my degree. and the fact you get to deal with science and really nerd out, but also get to know people on a very personal basis. And in family medicine, especially, like you get those longitudinal relationships that, for me, make it all worth it. You get to really see people grow and change over time, and you become a very key player in how they grow.
That's really special. Like, I think being able to see those people through time and like to get, and you're someone that comes into it so well-rounded. Like, you're such a creative person, but such a like scientific and logical thinker at the same time. So to kind of be with those people throughout their entire, life journey, coming from like your creative, but also super rational brain, that must be really neat to kind of experience.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, and the reason why I fell away from other specialties where the patient encounters are a little bit more transient was because I didn't like not knowing how people's stories ended. You'd see them in the emergency department and then you discharge them home and never really know what happened to them. So the fact that I will get to follow my patients throughout their lives and know what happens to them is, for me, one of the best parts.
That's really cool. Also kind of speaks to your love of literature, I'd say.
Maybe.
All right. So today we're going to be exploring the concept of diet culture a little bit. So when you think of that term as a doctor, how would you describe or define that term?
So this was a really interesting question. I think medically speaking, we could approach it from several different avenues. The one part that I find interesting is actually this concept of, like, quote, the healthy diet, right? And we see this get thrown around in casual conversation in the media. And oftentimes there's really no true definition attached to it. And even in the office too, when I'm encountering patients, so I'll be seeing a patient and I'll ask them about their dietary habits. And they'll say, you know what, it's pretty healthy, or, a mix. I like to eat healthy, but I also like to splurge too. And then I'll ask them, okay, so what do you mean by healthy? And this is really when it gets really vague about like, oh, well, I eat vegetables, or I try and cut down on gluten. So everyone's definition of healthy is actually very different, which is really fascinating to me. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of this is actually based in the background of where they're coming from, and perhaps speaks to this idea of diet culture. So for me, I try to come up with what I think would be a good definition of this. And I think if I had to define it, it would be as the interplay between a person's biographical factors. So this could include their upbringing, their culture, religion, socioeconomic status, their current or desired health status, and their individual goals, among other things. So the interplay between these things and their dietary preferences that contributes to a predictable behaviors related to eating and food choices.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. So for we in the medical profession, we're interested in how this culture and how all these biographical factors lead to predictable behaviors that in turn lead to certain morbidities and mortalities.
Interesting. I like the term interplay. I think that's a really interesting one that kind of captures the, how it kind of can change and fluctuate.
Exactly. Yeah. And it will over time too.
Mm-hmm. That's really cool. And then you were saying, so you look at predictable factors? Is that what you're saying? Okay. So can you kind of break that term down a little bit?
So more so predictable behaviors.
Right.
So, based off of someone's culture that they bring to how they perceive diet, how they perceive food, you can almost predict what kind of behaviors they will do based off of that. I'm trying to think of a good example here.
Maybe how about like someone who's just going off to university for the first time?
So I guess in that sense, we think of university as a time when people are gaining probably their first shred of independence away from their families. It's the first time they're ever going to be choosing their own foods. And I think what you see in this phenomenon of the freshman 15 or the freshman 10 is people tend to go a little bit nuts with it, right? Like they suddenly have decisions over their own foods, how much they can eat, when to eat, and in a way that leads to almost a bit of a overconsumption. Mm-hmm. So despite the fact that they may have been raised under a certain dietary preference or dietary culture, that seems to shift when they are now in this new situation, out eating with their friends and suddenly with this newfound independence. So I guess that's a good example of it changing over time.
In your experience as a medical professional, do you find that you're hearing a lot of concerns about diets from patients or family and friends now that you've kind of become a doctor in the family and friend circle as well? Or is that not so much like a big topic when you are meeting with people?
In the clinic, it's definitely a big topic. Like I think I at least have one patient encounter each day where we'll discuss diet, if not more than that, because, I'll have at least one diabetic visit per day, and usually in that appointment we'll discuss diet. But as I said, it's usually very like generalized, like, oh, how's your diet? It's healthy. Okay, let's move on. We have 10 minutes. But there will be points where people will actually come to me with very specific questions about, what kind of diet should I do? What do you think about this diet, et cetera. I guess this fits with, I was doing some research about this. A lot of patients actually perceive their family doctor as the best healthcare professional to provide nutritional care.
Yeah.
Whether or not we actually have the expertise to back this up. And I know we're going to talk about this a bit later.
Yes, I want to dig into that.
Yeah. But it makes sense because diet is really, it's considered a cornerstone of health. And we as family doctors, we deal in primary care and preventative care. So of course it should be something that falls within our scope of practice. So as I said, a lot of questions are related to the different dietary trends. Should I be on a multivitamin, or am I deficient in vitamin D? What can I do to improve this? And then people will often come in with self-diagnosed food allergies or intolerances, some which are more accurate than others.
I'm sure.
Something else that I actually was reflecting on when I was preparing for this was an interesting phenomenon I've noticed at the end of life, and the role of eating an appetite at the end of life, and the role of eating an appetite as a marker of actually well-being and health. So a good example is when people are sick in hospital nearing the end of their life, we know that it's not uncommon for their appetites to be suppressed and for them to stop eating altogether.
Interesting.
But for a lot of family members and friends who are at the bedside, this is actually a really distressing phenomenon for them. Like as part of family meetings and rounds, they'll often request medications to help stimulate appetite, or they'll demand that, we insert an IV or a feeding tube so that way we can keep feeding them and helping them to eat. Even if this is not necessarily in line with, goals of care or with their prognosis. And it's very fascinating. And, I understand where they come from. Like, this is my loved one. They need to eat. They need their energy. But one of the things I try and tell people is, this is a natural course of the disease they have. The fact that they're not hungry is just their body telling you that, it's not functioning as well as it was. And in some cases, it's shutting down. And it can be really hard for people to come to terms with this. So for me, in end of life care, I actually consider it a milestone when the family does accept that their loved one is no longer able to eat.
Interesting.
It seems to be like a necessary step in the process of saying goodbye and accepting that death is the natural endpoint for that person.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Because it's so, I was thinking as you're talking about how when a loved one is sick or, even just like has the flu, the first thing you do is offer them soup or like some sort of food gesture. So I can't imagine how hard that must be for end of life care to, to even think about food as like the symbol of giving up or like letting go rather.
Yeah. I know. I just remember one point, an example from medical school where it was a woman who she'd had a stroke and she wasn't able to swallow anymore, and she was quite old and didn't have much of, I guess, from a medical perspective, her quality of life would be considered quite poor. But for her husband, he couldn't possibly imagine not feeding her anymore and was fervently demanding that we consult general surgery to put a feeding tube into her stomach, and without really understanding that procedure in itself has risks. So it's very fascinating. And I understand where he comes from, right? This is his loved one, his wife of so many years. And the idea of watching her starve potentially as part of her death is quite distressing.
Yeah, certainly. And especially like when you don't have that, medical prowess and you don't really know how to, or what's going on in someone's body or how to deal with it. That's kind of like an easy, or like a go-to for sure for some people.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So what are some of the main misconceptions or problems that you think we're facing when you think about diet culture in general, like in Canada or North America? What are some of those main misconceptions or problems that you think are that you see as circulating?
So this is a great question. And this is one where I actually polled a bunch of my co-residents about this because we see a lot of this in our clinics. First and foremost, I think we all came to the agreement that we need to, as a society, shatter this idea that there's a single diet that is better than any other.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we don't have any evidence to back this up. And I think it's actually quite limiting to approach diet in this way. So we've got, good evidence for low-fat diets, vegetarian diets, the DASH diet, which is one for hypertension specifically, and the Mediterranean diet. And we know that certain disease processes seem to respond well to these diets. But I think most family doctors would agree that the best diet for any one person is actually the diet that they can stick to first and foremost.
True.
And one that optimizes the things that we know make a difference. So specifically, limiting the intake of saturated and trans fats, eliminating free sugars and salt, and increasing fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and whole grains. Like, that is the WHO definition of ideal diet. And that's the one that seems to have the most evidence that can really fit within any diet or any lifestyle.
Cool. Yeah, that definitely seems like it's especially if it's coming from WHO, like even what you're saying was very general, but enough to like, you could kind of fit it into any cultural or social background.
Yeah. And in terms of like weight loss specifically, because I know this is one of the big things that people are interested in when they are talking about diet in our office, a lot of studies show that it's actually structure and social support that seem to make the difference, less so than limiting any certain macronutrient.
So by structure, do you mean structure in terms of balanced diet or structure in terms of general day-to-day schedule?
Both.
Okay.
I guess an example that I came up with to illustrate this would be actually just thinking about the vegetarian diet, right? So we've got good evidence that there's a lower incidence of obesity and heart disease, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, certain cancers with this diet, but you could really easily fill your day with carbs and processed vegan-friendly foods and still call yourself a vegetarian without necessarily gaining the same health benefits, right? Oreos are vegan.
Yeah, right. That's a classic example.
But eating Oreos several times a day is not going to give you the same health benefits as those things I noted above. So, I could call myself a vegetarian and therefore I'm healthy, but if I'm not doing those things like eating more vegetables and fruits, am I really gaining the same benefits of the vegetarian diet?
Interesting. Yeah. I think I heard the term, I remember like in nutritional class, it was looking at nutritionally dense foods versus foods that were not nutritionally dense. I can't remember the second term, but that kind of stuck with me in terms of thinking about the nutrition within the food, not just like how filling it is.
Yeah, like the empty calories idea, right?
That's yeah.
Yeah.
Coffee's really not hitting me today.
I guess another interesting thing that I've noticed is that when we look at specific cultures that have less disease and longer life expectancies, what we've noticed is it's more so that diet is one part of a larger culture that emphasizes healthy behaviors, one where physical activity and social support are emphasized and where meals are more mindful and serve a specific social function. So the Mediterranean diet is the perfect example of this. When they started developing the diet, they were looking at, okay, what kind of things seem to make this population different? And it's the fact that a lot of these people, when they're eating their meals, they sit down and it's like multiple hours and it's a big social event, and everyone brings food and makes food fresh at home. So they really think that this is more so the important factor than actually what they're eating specifically, which is like the high those good fats, the avocados, the fish fats. So when Brazil actually came up with their new food guide, which is awesome, and I recommend everyone to look it up if they can.
I'll put it in the show notes for everyone so they can look, because it's so cool.
It's just their focus has really shifted away from this idea, eat so many foods within a certain category, to you should eat at home and cook at home and eat in groups. Like, it's just very holistic. And I think they're taking from this idea that it seems to be more of a healthy behavior lifestyle rather than picking certain foods here and there.
It's such a cool shift. I'm noticing, in terms of national food guidelines, but also even medical professionals, or like how anthropologists and everyone are starting to talk about health. So it's really cool to see that. moving into looking at doctors and their own nutritional knowledge, can you speak to some of the personal or professional barriers that you think that doctors face when it comes to their own nutritional knowledge or when it comes to sharing nutritional knowledge?
So this is something that even when I was doing my research for this, it is not unknown, the fact that medical education around nutrition is poor. Brian Goldman, who is the host of White Coat Black Art, actually did a piece for CBC in January 2017 about this and referenced a few interesting studies. There was one where they actually did a test, an 18-point nutrition questionnaire for medical students who were entering residency to become pediatricians. And the average mark was actually just 52%.
Oh my gosh.
In medical school. So, and they've also looked at like whether or not schools within a certain academic year were meeting the minimum requirement for teaching on nutrition, which is actually only 25 hours of teaching. And, you know, this particular study, which was looking at the 2008 to 2009 academic year, it was just 27% of the 105 medical schools were meeting this minimum requirement of teaching.
Really?
Yeah. So I went around, I polled, you know, my co-residents. I'm like, how much did you guys get? Because, of course, I trained at McMaster, and some of my colleagues from the other medical schools said, you know, we got one lecture and that was it. And then, you know, hopefully you would interact with a nutritionist on or a dietitian on the rotations and maybe do some extra reading here and there. But in terms of dedicated teaching time for nutrition, it's actually quite low. And they're not really testing for it either. So they looked at the licensing exam that we have to do in order to become licensed physicians. And this particular panel, they were interested in obesity and are we being assessed on our knowledge of obesity? And they noted that really this was not well tested on these licensing exams. And this is interesting given the fact that obesity is viewed as one of the major health crises we're facing right now.
Yeah, definitely. And to have that, you'd think like having a solid foundation of how food affects obesity would be discussed. Do you find it is in terms of obesity or other specific health issues, or is it kind of the same as general nutrition in that sense?
Like, we learn about obesity in the context of other diseases, like, you know, as a risk factor for certain diseases. And like, we understand that obesity is important and that we should be assessing for obesity. Like, when patients come into my office, we'll take their weight and we'll calculate their BMI. But, you know, I'm trying to think of how many times I've actually sat down with someone who, you know, was on the border between overweight and obese and actually said, you know, your weight's a little high, let's talk about how we can improve this. Like, because oftentimes they come in with their own things that they want to talk about, and that takes up most of the appointment. So, you know, we understand it's important, we understand that we should be talking about it, but I feel like the big struggle is actually finding time to fit this into our appointments. And I guess this leads into another point that one of my co-residents noted when we were discussing this. She said, you know, true, we don't get a lot of training in nutrition and how to discuss nutrition with our patients, but is this something that we should be doing given the fact that, you know, our scope is so broad and we have a lot of other things we need to cover? She said, we've got dietitians, you know, we've got those people who have that background and who are able to keep up with, you know, the studies that are coming out, because there are, you know, many each year that come out and then are constantly changing the landscape of, you know, what we should be doing in terms of nutrition. So she said, I don't think it's unreasonable for us to outsource this role to other members of the extended healthcare team. But of course, the issue with this is accessibility to dietitians is very variable within our system.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you're lucky to be in a family health team that has a dietitian, often you can see them for free without any concerns. Whether you see them within a week or a few weeks probably depends on how many people are being referred to them. I worked in one clinic where I was seeing a patient. It was a younger patient. I think she was in her 20s, and she had a lot of questions about diet. And I said, you know what, why don't I refer you to the dietitian? She'll be able to answer all these questions. She's more up to date. And so I went to go chat with my preceptor about it. And he was like, oh, well, actually, our dietitian is just for people who have diabetes.
Oh.
And I was like, oh, okay. Which it was a bit backwards for me, because I was like, why are we not using this resource to help prevent disease?
Yeah.
when we know that for people who are in that kind of pre-diabetes or at-risk group can really benefit from intensive dietary modification. So it was a bit interesting. Luckily, my family health team that I work in, our dietitians available to all patients, regardless of what their question is. But that was something that was a little bit interesting to see.
Yeah, and I can imagine too, I mean, if you're a dietitian and you're looking more towards diabetes patients, your understanding of like how people should be eating or what sorts of foods you would need would probably be pretty different than like a, healthy 20-something that is just curious about food. So that's really interesting as well.
Yeah. And then for the people who do not have a dietitian in their family health team, you have to go find one yourself. And unfortunately, it's not covered by OHIP. So those people would have to pay out of pocket if they wanted that information. So that's what makes it challenging, right? If I didn't have access to a dietitian and I had a patient who had lots of questions about diet, I would probably feel pretty uncomfortable, saying, oh, sorry, no, you have to go pay for this service because I can't handle it. Like, I'll obviously do what I can and try and give them the information I can. And for me, often what I'll do is I'll refer them to some credible sources I know online. But any way I can engage in those conversations, I will try to, because I know from the patient's perspective, it's very important to them that their family doctor does, have some degree of expertise in this area.
Yeah. Or even the point that you made about your colleague saying that it's not necessarily your role, I think is a pretty good point and an important point to remember, that like you have so much knowledge that you have to retain. So if you can kind of move it towards someone who's a little bit more knowledgeable or an expert on that, then it definitely makes sense to do so.
I think it's within our scope to like stimulate these conversations. Like when a patient comes in, I think it falls on me to not just be like, oh, are you healthy? To actually, dig in a bit deeper and identify maybe where some of the shortcomings are, and then direct them and refer them appropriately. Like that is within my scope, and that's something that I should be doing as a family doctor. In terms of the nitty-gritty details of specific diets, intermittent fasting, blah, blah, blah. Like I recognize that I don't have expertise in that area. So at that point, referring out, I think, is completely reasonable, the same way I'd refer out for any other medical condition that requires, a different expertise.
Yeah. And I think it's, I can't remember if you said this. I think we were out for lunch a while ago, and you said something about how, it's not general practice anymore, right? It's family practice. So in family practice, you're kind of like that gateway person for someone's health, right? And I love that. I think that's a really great way of understanding your role in someone's health.
And I guess the final barrier issue, I think, that we face in the medical field and by extension in society is the fact that a lot of the research related to diet and health is, actually very low quality when you look at it.
Yeah.
Outside of overweight and obese populations, there are actually very few well-designed studies that compare different diets, which is probably why we don't have any recommendations about one diet versus the other. On average, a lot of the studies we do have seem to include a higher proportion of female participants than males, which obviously isn't representative of our population. And then a lot of these studies that look at specific diets tend to use very strict dietary recommendations, where they'll either lose patients to fall out, like they just can't keep up with the intervention, or the intervention is so strict that there's no way that the average person would be able to do it in their day-to-day life. So it makes it challenging for us to even recommend certain things, because the evidence we have for these things is so variable.
Interesting.
And, if we look at the number of trials that compare pharmacotherapy or medications as a treatment for a disease versus diet as a treatment, all the studies looking at pharmacotherapy far outweigh that for diet. And this is something that, I think we as a society that really prioritizes convenience, we're perpetuating this. For a lot of people, it's easier for them to treat their cholesterol with a pill than by changing their dietary habits. And as long as this remains a prominent value, I think we're going to continue just having more and more studies that look for that one solve pill.
Yeah, like the quick fix.
Versus studies that look into diet and exercise and specific recommendations for those.
Interesting. And it's also like, as someone that's in food studies somewhat, it's always so interesting to me, like when you do food recalls or like food frequency questionnaires, it's so difficult to get, like you're not ever going to get an accurate reporting on what people are eating. So I can't imagine like when you're going into the deeper nutritional element of things to kind of be able to break that down without that bias reporting. Like you're not going to get a perfect study. So it's definitely, yeah, like there's so many challenges in terms of food research that you wouldn't get the same with pills.
And that seems like, unfortunately, one of the inherent shortcomings of it, right? Is it's just a challenging field to study. And we, at this point, don't have the same funding going into those studies.
Yeah, certainly. So I'm really interested in how, I'm interested in seeing how health is understood in different contexts by different people. So what, as a doctor or as, your own personal health, how would you define health for yourself? And what role, if any, do you see nutrition playing in your understanding of health?
So I'm lucky here in that my personal and professional opinion are one and the same.
Nice.
In that I see health as well-being. In medical school, we learn that health is not the absence of disease, but something that incorporates all aspects of a person's sense of wellness. So again, if we're referencing WHO here, the World Health Organization, they note all these specific pillars of health that include the mind, the body, the person's societal connections, etc. So that's what we learn in medical school. And this is something I identify with as well. Personally, for me, health is going for a walk to clear your mind and get some exercise, but it's also taking some time to sit on the couch and watch Netflix when you need to, and you need that time to yourself. And I think what causes some conflict is the fact that different aspects of wellness can compete with each other. So the challenge is finding the optimal balance for that individual person that really optimizes their health overall. So I've got my diabetic patients who I want them to cut down on their added sugar so they can prevent the sequelae of uncontrolled diabetes, but I also want them to be able to enjoy their lives, not feel like their life is completely dominated by this disease that they have. But this idea can get tricky when it comes to things like drugs of abuse, right? And people who have addictions, where for them that substance that gives them a sense of mental well-being is also so disastrous to other aspects of their health and their well-being. And it's often more challenging to find that balance in that sense. I think it's also interesting if we think about the definition of health at someone's end of life. So I do have a special interest in kind of end of life care and that kind of thing. So
yeah, that's so fascinating.
When we look at someone who's dying from advanced cancer, heart disease, or some other life-limiting illness, we'll often say that person is in poor health, right? Like they're not well, they're unhealthy, or not unhealthy, but in poor health. But if we approach health more so as this idea of holistic well-being, it allows us to accept the fact that a person may still be able to maintain some wellness even as their bodies begin to fail. And this is something that palliative care actually really incorporates into their practice about maintaining comfort and wellness even as someone approaches the end of their life.
Interesting. So it's like a shifting in how you understand well-being for different contexts.
Yes, exactly.
Very cool. That's a really neat perspective.
So if we kind of bring this all around to the idea of nutrition and health, I think nutrition fits very naturally into all these different pillars of health that we have. It can dictate our physical health. It can influence our mental health, right? Nothing's more powerful than an ice cream cone on a hot day.
True.
And it intertwines within her social health, right? And forms relationships and dictates, certain cultural events. So as long as we remain organisms who depend on external sources of nutrition, we can't photosynthesize anything for ourselves. I think nutrition is always going to remain a key part of our existence.
Very cool. That's a really beautiful perspective. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so I want to, before we go, I just have 2 more questions for you. One I'm going to spring on you right now because I didn't put it in our prompts. So what is, because you're more than a doctor. I mean, you're an amazing doctor, but you're also this very well-rounded human being with lots of really cool experiences and perspectives. So what's the weirdest food that you've ever had?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not very adventurous when it comes to food, I'll be honest. I think the weirdest food I almost had was the guinea pig in Peru, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. And I'm lucky that I could identify as a vegetarian and therefore use that as a cop-out. But I wish I had tried it because, it's such a huge part of their culture there. It's actually very sustainable food in Peru for them. So I think I just couldn't get over the fact that it still looked like a leg.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Did it actually look like you could see it was very much a rodent?
Yeah. So that was kind of like, no. The weirdest food.
If you can't think of anything, that's fine. I think the guinea pig one's a pretty good example.
Yeah. Like I say, that was almost, and again, weird because it's not something that I'm used to eating and because it still looked like an animal that potentially I could have had as a pet at one point. But for them and when I was given this opportunity, it was when we were touring around kind of the smaller villages outside of Cusco. And I totally understood why it was one of their major food sources. And I was like, yeah, it totally makes sense that you eat it. But for me, I was like,
yeah, it's a pet here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, that's definitely a cool example. All right. So thank you so much for answering all the questions. You just have such an interesting take on diet and health and culture, and it's really lovely to speak with you. And before we go, I wanted to offer you the floor. So are there any upcoming projects or community events or initiatives or cool resources that you would like to share with the audience?
So I came up with a couple, but I guess I forgot to include my disclaimer here at the top, since...
Oh, I can put it at the top if you want to.
Or at the end. But basically, let it be known that I am still a trainee, that my thoughts here are my own and do not reflect, those of McMaster University where I'm training, and are not a substitute for actual medical advice. So if you have questions or concerns about your diet, you should go see your family doctor. So you can leave this here because I think one of the things I want to say is if you have any concerns about your health, if you're due for, your pap smear or anything like that, go see your family doctor. Preventive health care is something I'm passionate about. And I think just taking those extra steps for yourself is a huge part of health while we're on that topic. I just want to highlight one of the resources I'll refer people to if they have questions about diet and nutrition would be what was formerly called Eat Right in Ontario, but is now unlockfood.ca. And this is run by a group of dietitians of Ontario, and you can email a dietitian with questions or get in touch with one. So if they're having trouble accessing that kind of resource, or you feel like you're not having those conversations in the same capacity you'd like with your family doctor, then that's a great resource. A personal passion of mine, which may not be as applicable to some members of your audience, is related to advanced care planning. So there's this great movement called Speak Up that focuses on encouraging people to write down and have conversations related to their goals of care when it comes to if they were too sick to make their own health decisions or if they're approaching the end of their life. I think there's a lot of chaos when people are very unwell, when their family members don't really know what they would want, since they can't make their own decisions. So any chance I get, I really encourage people to start thinking about, what they would want done in certain situations. Like, would you want your organs donated? Would you want someone to perform CPR on you? And just start having those conversations with your family earlier rather than later, just so if that time ever comes, and hopefully it never does, that they're able to confidently act in a way that is consistent with what you would want.
Great. That's a really great idea. And I think a lot of people don't, like myself included, you don't really think about those questions at all, which goes to tell you that your family would probably have no idea what you want. So that's a really great initiative. Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for sharing everything, Beth. And thank you for being on Anthodish.
Thank you for having me.
That was Dr. Beth Jolley, a family medicine resident in Southern Ontario. You can find the Brazilian Food Guide, the Speak Up campaign, and the Unlock Food Dietitian resource in the show notes below. Thanks for tuning into Anthodish today. We'll see you next time.